Hello, everybody. We're going to continue our conversation about Unit 2 and the events in the developing colonies. We had just spoken about the Pequot War and found out that an important page turning moment, mostly because it's going to set the standard for how the English settlers will deal with the Native Americans, which will continue into American history as well with the United States. We will continue to do the same. If a native group is on land that we want, we will force them to leave. And if they don't leave, then they will experience some violence between the two groups. The Pequot War happening in Connecticut, a few years later, in 1676, we're going to have the same situation happen with our King Philip's War. Now, King Philip's War, which as you can see on the map, is within Massachusetts, New England area once again. So it's just a continued behavior between the English colonists and the Native Americans. And if you notice, there's, in this case, more of a war. Pequot War was just like one major event that had smaller events afterwards. Here, this is an actual war that lasts for about a year. Now, King Philip, which is he's a Narragansett Wampanoag chief. King Philip's not really his name. His real name is Metacom, and you can see it on the map here. Metacom is his real name, but as you know, the English always anglicize everything, right? So since he's a chief, he must be a king, and they don't like the name Metacom, so they go with Philip, right? So either way, King Philip or Metacom is the same person. One of the reasons why he's fighting, and here's the difference with the Pequot War. The Pequot War, the English settlers had attacked the Pequots. In this case, Metacom will actually wage attacks in order to take back not just land, but also to resist European influence on their culture. As we remember from Ireland, and even just from what we've seen so far in the Americas, for the most part, the English settlers enforce their culture on other people. And so Metacom was attempting to keep his culture and native culture from assimilating to English, and in just resisting those English settlers from taking over. And so they waged war for about a year. It is actually considered to be one of the single bloodiest wars in American history per capita. But it all ended because Metacom will eventually be killed. And this is something we'll see often with Native American movements. Whenever the leader is killed or whatever, something happens to the leader, the whole event dissipates. And that's exactly what happens here. There isn't much of a hierarchy in leadership for the Native Americans. And so because of that, it just goes away, right? But again, just another example of resistance by the Native Americans, and an example of violence between the two groups. So what we're going to do now is we're going to start talking about some other colonies. We've spent some time in Jamestown. We've spent some time in Massachusetts and New England. But of course, we have more colonies to establish. We refer to the next series of colonies as the Restoration colonies because it's actually a throwback to the English Civil War. You might remember from World Civ learning about in the English Civil War, James I, then Charles I. Charles I was killed in the English Civil War, and then Cromwell was put in charge, and then Charles is brought back to power. So this is when Charles II is brought back to power, that is the Restoration. And so these are known as the Restoration colonies. English politics in the 17th century is complicated and violent. We don't need to know all of the details of what was going on in our mother country of England, but we do need to know how these politics impacted colonization throughout the 17th century. The first major phenomenon which we've mentioned was the English Civil War. With war raging in Europe, many Puritans fled to New England, resulting in a population boom around Massachusetts Bay Colony and expansion to form new towns and cities. Over the 1630s and 40s, Cromwell, who was the Puritan leader and opponent to the English monarchy, rose to power. When the Civil War concluded with Charles I executed, Cromwell's power also grew. Cromwell adopted the title of Lord Protector. Remember that from World Civ? He's the Lord Protector of England, and had the power of a monarch. And for a number of years under his reign, colonization to the Americas slowed down. But Cromwell's reign didn't last forever, and the monarchy was restored by Charles II when the House of Stuart was restored to power. Colonization resumed pretty seriously, and Charles II began to distribute proprietorships to his allies, kind of like giving out candy. And these new colonies were dubbed Restoration colonies because they occurred as a result of the restoration of the Stuart line. He is the Stuart king. This is all very technical, but the impact of the Restoration is an early turning point in the 17th century English colonization. Many of the early colonial efforts were joint stock ventures. So think of like Jamestown, think of Massachusetts Bay. Those are all joint stock companies. And colonization was conceived as a get-rich-quick enterprise. And they also didn't have much of influence by the royal families. But the Restoration colonies were different. They were envisioned as a permanent settlement in which proprietors would yield power and govern over large tracts of land. In this particular case, like when we have like Carolina, which then is split into North and South, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, a proprietor is like a person. It is somebody who is given the right to reign. As a proprietor, I could rule over my colony in any way that I see fit. And then, of course, the king will get kickbacks from however the colony does. Additionally, we have to somewhat think about how, since the king is granting these proprietorships, that means that the king has a little bit more say in what's going on than in Jamestown or Massachusetts Bay or Plymouth, right? So we're almost seeing a little bit of a tightened grip on the colonies during these restoration colonies. Now, the Restoration colonies can refer to any of these colonies initially chartered or captured by the English during the rule of Charles II. The two most prominent ones are Carolina and Pennsylvania. So we're going to start with Carolina. After the Stuarts' power was restored, Charles gave a number of his allies a charter to make them feudal-style proprietors in the land between Virginia and Spanish Florida. The colony of Carolina, society in Carolina, a vision outlined in the fundamental constitutions for Carolina, was somewhat feudal. Think of like last year when you would learn about feudal Europe. While different religions, Christian and non-Christian alike, were tolerated, it was far from an egalitarian society. In its framework, aristocracy and the institution of slavery would be protected, provisions that would shape the role of Southern elite whites and African slaves for hundreds of years. So in the way that we think of a social class in Europe, we're going to see very much of that reflected here. But the northern and southern parts of Carolina developed a little differently. Rice planters and migrants from the English Caribbean settled in the South and established the city of Charleston. Quickly, the territory that would become South Carolina would produce wealthy plantations with huge slave populations, while the territory that would become North Carolina would remain somewhat poorer, less aristocratic, and with smaller farms. Disputes between the proprietors resulted in a separation of the colony into North and South in 1712. Now, what's fascinating about this, right, is we're seeing these, when I had said to you about, right, these large slave plantations, in South Carolina in particular, they actually had more slaves than they did English settlers living amongst their population. And this just creates that plantation style that we think of over in England that they did in Ireland, right? That they have total control over the people that are there, this aristocracy hierarchy. The second most prominent Restoration colony would be Pennsylvania. Although born into a distinguished Anglican family and the son of Admiral Sir William Penn, the younger William Penn joined the Religious Society of Friends, or what we call Quakers, at the age of 22. Quakers, which was another group of religious dissenters, grew in England during the 1600s. They refused to support the Church of England with taxes, refused to use conventional noble titles and addresses, swore no oaths, a particularly testy position, and were pacifists and very democratic. The persecution of Quakers became so fierce that Penn decided that it would be better to try to find a new, free Quaker settlement in North America. Some Quakers had already moved to North America, but the New England Puritans especially were as negative towards Quakers as the people back home. And some of them had been banished to the Caribbean. Charles II had a large loan with Penn's father, which made settling which Charles settled by granting the younger Penn a larger area west and south of New Jersey on March 4th, 1681. Now, William Penn, our proprietor here, had some really fascinating ideas on what Pennsylvania is meant to look like. Often he refers to it as this holy experiment, particularly for these Quakers, which we're going to see in a moment. We're going to look at a primary document of William Penn, his vision for Pennsylvania. And it seems to me that when we look at it, and I had mentioned it being somewhat democratic, we're going to see a lot of really interesting philosophies that differ from many of the other colonies that we've seen developed already. So we're going to move on to what we refer to as the borderlands. So the story of the English colonization of North America extends beyond the coastal territories. The English had minor settlements in the Caribbean where they were surrounded by their enemies, the colonial superpower of Spain, their rival France, and adversary the Netherlands. The Spanish settled in Florida and effectively controlled the Gulf of Mexico, Mexico itself, and modern-day Texas, and the modern American Southwest. West of the colonies was the backcountry, where they were in a perpetual stalemate with the natives or open conflict, and beyond that, they were developing French colonies in large territory of Louisiana. These borderlands were crucial in how the mainland colonies developed. So in these borderlands, right, beset by enemies on all sides, the English government was determined to protect their holdings in Carolina and maintain control from the Spanish on the outskirts. Hence, the colony of Georgia would be chartered in 1732 under the leadership of James Oglethorpe. Yes, James Oglethorpe. Georgia was the last to be established of the English colonies in North America. Its formation was due to a desire of the British government to protect South Carolina from an invasion by the Spaniards from Florida and by the French from Louisiana, as well as the desire of James Oglethorpe to found a refuge for the persecuted Protestant sects and the unfortunate but worthy impoverished classes of Europe. The English settlements in the Caribbean, on the other hand, set the blueprint for the plantation system and racial oppression that would become a part of the DNA of the American South for at least through the U.S. Civil War. Sugarcane was the crop that was primarily cultivated in the Caribbean, and the work was so labor-intensive that the English settlers began to import African slaves. The circumstances in the Caribbean were very, very miserable. There were 7 major slave revolts before one major instance occurred in the mainland colonies. And planters were so fearful of these revolts and aiming to preserve their own standing that they passed laws restricting the rights of slaves and empowering whites and their masters, an early process that began to link Africans with slavery in general. The plantations grew and became intricate in power, and like the slavery laws, were transplanted into the American colonies to the north during this late 17th and early 18th centuries. I want to give you an example of what I mean by creating laws and that were restrictive of Africans, because I'm sure in your head you're thinking to yourself, but like, being a slave, isn't that just restrictive in itself? And you're absolutely correct. However, some of these laws are going to make and evolve slavery into worse and worse conditions. So I want to give you an example. So if I look at Virginia, this is an example of one of those codes that started in the Caribbean that were brought into the Americas. And this is coming to us from Virginia. So if we read this, right, this is law. So this is like codified, right? All servants imported and brought into the country, you don't have to write this in your notes, obviously, I'm just showing you something, who are not Christians in their native country shall be accounted and be slaves. All Negro, mulatto, and Indian slaves within this dominion shall be held to be real estate. We're going to come back to that in a second. If any slave resist his master, correcting such slave, and shall happen to be killed in such correction, the master shall be free of all punishment, as if such accident never happened. So this is telling me, right? So they're justifying slavery by saying they're not Christian, right? All servants imported who are not Christians in their native country shall be slaves. Okay, so that's what they're sort of justifying there. They're also saying anybody who is a slave within this dominion, right, within this area of control, shall held to be real estate. That's actually a really important word. As we know, words matter, right? And real estate is just another word for property. So with it being property, right, with having a slave be property, they then go on to say that if a slave master is punishing a slave and then that slave is killed in that situation, the master is free of all punishment as if such accident never happened. Meaning, it's sort of like, well, that's your fault. You killed your slave, so you're not going to get in trouble, even though it's, I don't know, murder, right? So here we have very early on, see, this is 1705. Virginia is making these laws, right? So that it's preventing anything or anybody from stopping that behavior in the South. And it really evolves as the time goes on, started in the Caribbean and is brought up here. And we're going to take a look at some of these. We sometimes call them slave codes. Sometimes we call them black codes that are restrictive laws against the slaves. All right, everybody, you're going to go on to Schoology, and you're going to find an assignment there that looks at specifically Pennsylvania and then the Borderlands.